So welcome, everybody, and good morning. We here at the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy at City University of New York are fortunate to be surrounded by 25 educational entities that bring a wonderful spectrum of professional scholarship that should be enriching us every day in our practice, in our scholarship, in our research, and in our sense of community. As such, the CUNY School of Public Health is starting a new tradition of inviting scholars from around the university campuses to participate in this new venture of creating a special line of our grand rounds, bringing men and women of expertise to enrich our portfolio, educate our students, and inspire our faculty and administrators. I'm very, very proud that President Frank Wu, who serves as the 11th president of Queens College, is the inaugural speaker in this new activity. He was a member of the faculty at Howard University almost at the same time that I was in Washington, D.C. at GW. But Howard, as you know, is the nation's leading historically Black college, and he served for a decade. He is an author of Yellow Race in America Beyond Black and White. Prior to his academic career, he held a clerkship with the late U.S. District Judge Frank Battisti in Cleveland and practiced law with the firm of Morrison and Foerster in San Francisco. He received a BA from Johns Hopkins and a JD with honors from the University of Michigan. I've interacted with Frank since he arrived as the new president of Queens College and have recognized his acumen, his Renaissance approach to life, bringing art, culture, and science together, but most of all, his humility that connotes a great amount of greatness in scholarship and intelligence. But most of all, Frank is really very real, and the way he addresses life is very applicable to how we in public health address it. I'm very happy that we received such an enormous response to his lecture today with about 100 RSVPs online. And I'm very happy that those of you that have chosen to participate in person today made the effort to be here. And Frank, I need to tell you that some of the participants I see around the room are either here because of their ethnic and cultural affiliation to the topic of the day, but many others that you would not know are from Turkey, for example, or have worked in Tokyo or in Hong Kong for many years of their life. So I think the audience is particularly interested in the topic, and I am personally honored that you chose to join us today. And the podium is yours.
Good morning. Allow me to return the compliment. Your dean is truly a Renaissance man, a Renaissance person, and it's always a delight to be seated next to him at the Council of Presidents meetings that the CUNY system holds once a month, and just to be able to benefit from his wisdom and his expertise, not only during the COVID-19 pandemic, but well beyond. He is a voice of reason. And so I'm humbled to be able to join you at this wonderful institution to share a little bit about Asian Americans, and I hope about race and diversity in this great democracy of ours. So I do have a set of PowerPoints, and I understand for the viewers who are streaming this that I need to stay behind this podium. Otherwise, I will be out of sight. So I will try to stay put right here. And we'll leave ample time for questions because dialogue is at the heart of what a democracy is all about. Let me start with, let me see if I can get these slides to work. Which button am I supposed to press here? These arrow buttons aren't dancing things. Oh, is it this one? No. All right. There we go. Okay. All right. Where are we without PowerPoint? Actually, yes. Oh, all right. Since this is a webinar, we have no idea if the viewers at home can hear or if they're interacting at all, right? Presumably somebody will text if this isn't. Which is the modern way. Oh. Okay, we're good. Thank you so much. All right, let me start with the conventional framing, how we talk about race in America. Now, this isn't true around the world, but it has been true for most of the past century in the United States, and it's a black-white paradigm. There are ample examples of this. I'll just offer you two. So the central image here is of my hometown of Detroit in one of the long, hot summers of the 1960s when there was either a rebellion or a riot, and your choice of words signifies your perspective on the events. Suffice it to say, lives were lost, homes and businesses were destroyed. The National Guard and the United States Army Reserve, they were called in tanks rolled down Woodward Avenue, the major thoroughfare. Detroit was not the only major United States city to experience this trauma. It happened in city after city after city in 1967 and then again in 1968. This prompted the federal government to commission a blue ribbon bipartisan panel to take a look at the root causes of what had happened. It was called the Kerner Commission, named for Otto Kerner, the governor of Illinois. They produced a famous report, the Kerner Report. You can see it there. And they ended with a stark conclusion. They said that America was not united. It was instead two nations, black and white, separate, hostile, and unequal. This is a rare display of rhetoric for a bureaucratic document that this blue ribbon panel would describe this nation in such terms. That was borrowed by a professor, Andrew Hacker, for a bestseller in the 1990s. Professor Hacker, by coincidence, happens to be on the faculty at Queens College. He's 95 years old and is still teaching. We actually just celebrated his 95th birthday, just as an aside. We think he's probably among living faculty members, the one who has been the most active over the longest period of time. He began his career in 1955 and is still going strong in 2024. So he wrote a book called Two Nations, borrowing the closing words of the Kerner Report. And he described America as black and white, separate, hostile, and unequal. Now, let me praise his book. It is a compendium of every statistic you could possibly imagine, showing meaningful disparities, whether due to discrimination or other causes, and all of them to the disadvantage of persons who identify or are identified by others as black relative to whites. His book also is typical of its era. And while it is factual, it is accurate, it is persuasive, it is stark. Like most of the books about race that were produced then, and even some now, when you pick it up, as you might judge from the title, you could infer this, he addresses two and only two populations. He divides the United States into those who are black and those who are white. Now, when I was an undergraduate, I'd like to think not that long ago, but it was long enough ago that it was pre-internet, and to do research, you had to go to the library and look things up in a hard catalog. Now, I'm going to guess almost all of you in this room are at least old enough to remember that. So you'll recall every book was indexed by author, by title, and by subject, 3 different ways. And I wanted to write a paper as a sophomore. This is some 40 years ago now, a sophomore in college, on Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the library and I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights. There were no books. They just didn't exist. There were 2 books about Asian Americans. That was it, two books. I checked them out. And you know how back then, when you checked a book out, at the back there was a slip of paper that would be stamped with the due date, and you could see if the book had circulated by how many stamps it had. These books had not circulated. I may have been the first person to have checked them out of that library. I read the 2 books, and I could then proclaim to have read all of the books in my field, and 2 books more than any faculty member at the institution where I was an undergraduate. I then commenced to read books about race. And it didn't matter whether they were by sociologists, whether they were by historians, whether they were by journalists, pundits, celebrities. It didn't matter if they were by liberals or conservatives, reactionaries or libertarians. Every one of the books used a black-white paradigm, by which I mean the author would talk only about individuals and communities that identified as black or white. Now, some of them would have a footnote or a parenthetical, and they would say, well, there are some other people, but I don't know anything about them, and they're not significant to this story. And I looked at these books, dozens of them, and I was perturbed, maybe even offended, not as an Asian American, no, as a student who wanted to write a good term paper and get a good grade, because all I had to do was stroll across campus and I could see that there were people who were Latino, there were people who were Asian, there were people proud of their mixed ancestries, there were people who didn't fit into these 2 boxes. And I thought, this isn't quite right. The picture that's being presented is not accurate. And you're all trained as scientists and social scientists. I would posit that to talk about policy, to talk about anything normative or prescriptive, you need to begin with a foundation that is factual, to have a picture of the world that corresponds to the reality. That is what I set out to do. I wanted to write a book, and eventually I did. I turned my sophomore term paper into a book some 20 years later. But what I found as I undertook this work is that the idea that I had was not mine. You know, undergraduates have this conceit. They think every idea that ever pops into their head is original. It's their idea. No one else has ever thought that before. But as I did this work, I came across W.E.B. Du Bois, a race man, founder of the NAACP, the first editor of the magazine that august civil rights organization published, Crisis. The first African-American to have earned a doctorate from Harvard University. So erudite was he, a sociologist when that field was yet new. When people would compliment him, Dr. Du Bois, what an honor it is to be the first Black person to have received a PhD from Harvard, he would reply, this is probably apocryphal, that the honor had been Harvard's to confer it upon him. He wrote newspaper columns, magazine articles. He wrote novels, plays, studies that are worth reading today of the Reconstruction era, studies that looked at the condition of African Americans when hardly anyone was doing that using empirical evidence. And in 1903, he wrote a magisterial volume of essays that blended memoir, sociology, and history. It's never been out of print. So if you're an author, imagine that from 1903 to today, you can still buy multiple editions of his work, Souls of Black Folk. And if you've ever studied race, you know the quote that I have here. What's interesting about this quote, and students sometimes write papers, or these days they turn to AI, and they quote this specific line. But if they do that in the way that I've displayed it here, I know they have not read the actual essay, because perhaps they've relied on AI. Because if you go and look at the passage and you read it, you will see the idea that I had, race beyond black and white. It's not my idea at all. It's W.E.B. Du Bois's idea. He said, and he was prescient because he was writing in 1903 at the dawn of a new century, said the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Now, typically that quote is lifted and taken out of context and people just stop there. But if you continue reading, there's a dash and he continues. The relation of the darker to the lighter races of men, I'm sure he would say women today, in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. Those additional words are not superfluous, they're not surplus. They show that as dedicated as Du Bois was to the cause of equality, to the uplift of a race, to the struggle for civil rights, for Blacks who were disenfranchised legally and socially, he situated that within a context which was universal. And he saw no contradiction. He saw that his cause was helped, not harmed, if he understood that it was part of something bigger. That's the project to which I propose we return. And the remainder of my talk is an effort just to illuminate a small piece of this, not to advance Asian pride, but instead to suggest that just as race is not figuratively black and white, so too it is not metaphorically, figuratively, symbolically black and white. It is much more complex than that. And I'd like to offer you some examples. So let's take a look. Here are some demographics. This slide is out of date. It's deliberately out of date. Someone who works in my office looked at this PowerPoint slide deck when we were going to transmit it over here at the School of Public Health and said, you know, it says 2023 and a whole year has passed. I actually put these slides together half a decade ago, 4 or 5 years ago. And I've left this slide in. Why have I left it in? Because part of what I want to emphasize is the dynamism, the pace of change. When I say there are about 20 million Asian Americans, that is inaccurate because Asian Americans in proportional terms are the fastest growing single racial grouping. And of course, there aren't Asians in Asia, right? Asian American takes in so many populations, dozens, so many different linguistic communities, so many faiths that would not naturally identify organically that way in their nations of origin. But this will give you a little bit of a sense of Asian Americans who now are predominantly an immigrant population. So I, as someone who's Native American, am a minority within a minority. My parents, who came here in the early 1960s, are the norm. That is to say, if you were to look at New York City, if you were to look at the borough of Queens, probably at your student body as well, most people of Asian descent arrived here from elsewhere. Some as part of the so-called 1.5 generation, as children or adolescents, but now more than 2/3 of the Asian population in the United States is originally foreign born. By numerosity, the half dozen groups that are most populous are Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. And these have changed significantly over time. The Japanese American population was formerly one of the largest, but because migration from Japan has tapered off, it hasn't dropped to zero, but it's just much less significant. And because rates of intermarriage now exceed 50%, those identifying as Japanese American are proportionally a much smaller piece of the overall Asian American population. So this gives you some sense, approximate though it may be, of the Asian American population, including here in New York City. Asian American population, like many other ethnic populations, is not uniformly distributed, though there are pockets, places you wouldn't expect, Midwest and the Deep South, places such as Las Vegas, which has become a heavily Asian immigrant city. By and large, the Asian American population remains concentrated in coastal areas and in Hawaii. So I always try to emphasize the diversity within diversity. So the Asian American population also includes both East Asian and South Asian and Southeast Asian. And it includes populations whose ancestors just a generation or two ago would have been fighting total wars against one another, but who here are told you all look alike. So I've put in just this slide to emphasize the South Asian population is distinct, and this includes so much of the diaspora. So especially in Queens, you will encounter people who proudly identify as Indo-Caribbean. That is to say, their great-great-grandparents migrated from South Asia, and then they or their parents migrated here to the United States in a form of secondary migration. The same is true for many other Asian populations. There are, for example, Latin American Chinese, whose native language is Spanish. It is not a Chinese dialect. It is not English. They're Spanish speaking, and some of mixed background or with names that would be recognizable stereotypically of Spanish origin because their families were there 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. So Asian Americans have struggled to become Asian Americans. Most people don't know this. They may be aware that there was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882, later expanded to create an Asiatic barred zone defined by latitude and longitude, and who constitutes an Asian person and what Asia and what the Orient are has changed over time as well. Much of what is today considered the Middle East was at one point considered the Orient. There are numerous nations and communities that in the American popular imagination are ambiguous. For example, people from the former Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union, as well as people from Turkey and elsewhere. In addition, though, to the Exclusion Act, there was a color line on naturalization not lifted until 1952. There were two famous Supreme Court cases, and I'll just mention them very briefly because this is not primarily a lecture on legal history. They involved a fellow named Ozawa and someone named Thind. They went up to the United States Supreme Court in the 1920s. Ozawa, born in Japan, English-speaking, assimilated Christian, petitioned to be a United States citizen. He wanted to naturalize. Back then, the statute said you had to be a free white person or of African nativity. Now, that's how it was defined in order to naturalize. Many of you in this room, or if not you, your parents have been through that ceremony to naturalize, right? You become an American. You pass a test, you're issued a little flag, and you go before the judge, you pledge allegiance, and so on. Ozawa desperately wished to do that. And the justices of the Supreme Court said, no, you are not a free white person. Free white persons, they said, in 1922, that term was synonymous with Caucasian. And they said, you're not Caucasian. Although Ozawa had actually argued that if you took it literally, he was white in the sense of pale. He said he was whiter than some of the swarthy peoples coming from Europe. Less than a year later, a fellow named Thind, here with a rifle, went up to the Supreme Court. Thind was a veteran of the United States Army. He had fought in what was then called the Great War. And there was a carve out. There was an exception, Japanese Americans, Japanese immigrants who had fought in the Great War. And this will shock people, but there were people of Asian descent who fought in the Great War for the United States. But it didn't apply to Thind. Thind went up to the Supreme Court and he actually argued using the latest anthropological theories of the time. This, remember, is pre-Nazism, pre-Hitler. He said not only was he Caucasian, he was Aryan. He actually made the argument that as a high caste South Asian, he, according to social scientists, would have been deemed Aryan. Therefore, he should be allowed to naturalize. The justices then said, no, the common person on the street would not recognize you as a free white person. You also are not a free white person. And those two gentlemen, Ozawa and Thind, were denied the opportunity to naturalize. So if anyone were wondering, legally, at least at that time, people of Asian descent were not white. When to be white actually conferred benefits. Sometimes you hear people talk about racial privilege. You may wonder, what is the empirical basis for that claim? Well, in the 1920s, it's easy to see. If you were a free white person, you could become a citizen with everything that followed, right? You could vote and so on and so forth. If you weren't, you couldn't. This slide is about Asian American participation in the civil rights movement, which also is little known. I'm going to be brief here because I want to get to some of the other empirical data. I'll just show you a few photos because often people think everyone of Asian descent is in that once pejorative phrase, fresh off the boat. It then became a hit television sitcom and was reappropriated as a term. That's just not so. I'll just tell you very quickly what these three photos are. The one from Life magazine, I always have to explain to young people, Life was like Instagram for your grandparents, right? It was the pictorial news magazine. It told you what was happening in the world. Some of you are old enough to remember Life. Life used to have a circulation approaching 10 million. You know, for a magazine, every family got Life, all right? So this is a famous photo. That's Malcolm X. He's been assassinated. He's in the Audubon Ballroom drawing his last breaths, not far from here, actually, in 1965. If you look right here, you'll see an Asian woman. You might wonder, well, is she some bystander who happened by? No, that's Yuri Kochiyama, famous Japanese-American radical associate of Malcolm X. She was part of his entourage. She traveled with him. She's cradling his head. She was part of the inner circle. Why? Because she identified with the struggle for Black equality. You also have Grace Lee Boggs and her husband, James Lee Boggs. They were labor organizers constantly under FBI surveillance. She was Chinese American. He was African American, the child of sharecroppers. And here is a photo of the Japanese American Citizens League with their banner proudly dressed in their Sunday best. They're about to march with Dr. King in 1963. After much internal debate, they decided they needed to be there. That organization, founded in 1929, initially limited to citizens, the native-born generation, so they were xenophobic in their own way. The organization created by Americans that would not admit their own parents into their membership because their parents were not Americans due to the racial bar. And this was reciprocal. This is just a quick slide to show you Dr. King and everyone except the nun in the front wearing Hawaiian leis. This is before air travel and Federal Express were common to Hawaii. Hawaii was only admitted to the Union in 1959. This photo is taken less than a half decade later. Why are they wearing leis? Because Dr. King, as a preacher, had associates, colleagues, friends who were Asian American Christian leaders in Hawaii who wished to show their support and send leis as Dr. King marched. And this is an image to show you that this went both ways, this allyship. So Asian Americans have been actually around, it's just a little bit more history, since far earlier than people know. This is probably one of the most famous examples of Asian American participation in US history, the Transcontinental Railroad, which united this continent in 1869 with the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah. The black and white photo in the center is the most famous of the images. There's a whole series of those. Any educated person in the US would have seen that photo or one of the series. If you look closely, you can pull out a magnifying glass. Even though the western half of that project, the work crew was predominantly Chinese immigrant men, they weren't invited to the party. When the Golden Spike was driven, none of the Chinese laborers, and there were more than 10,000 of them, could join the festivities. There was a fellow who passed away, actually, a Queens College alum. I put this together before I was president of Queens College. Just by coincidence, there are various Queens College references. There's a fellow named Corky Lee. A collection of his photographs was just published. He was the photographer of everything Asian American. And he staged a reenactment called it Photographic Justice, where he took the descendants of the railroad workers. These are now 5th, 6th, 7th generation Americans. They went out to this desolate part of Utah and took a photo with locomotives, and it was an annual pilgrimage. So this gives you a sense. Indeed, this book, published by the Park Service, when I first stumbled across this more than a decade ago, I don't think the term fake news had come into use then, but I thought this has to be fake news. It is not. Someone went through the National Archives and documented the hundreds, not talking about one or two, hundreds of Asian men who served in the United States Civil War in both the Union and Confederate armies. This is 1861 to 1865. That's astonishing. Even as someone who studies this history, I had no idea that the presence was so significant then. And that's an early photograph. That fellow, I believe, was an adoptee. And then there was violence, and Asian Americans were driven out with the depression that set in the United States in the 70s. That's it for the history. Now I'm going to turn to the two predominant images of Asian Americans. The first is the model minority myth. This actually is a public health issue. Allow me to explain. You might not have heard the term model minority, but even if you haven't, you know it. It's the idea that Asian Americans are whiz kids, rocket scientists, right? Child prodigies with perfect grades and test scores. They win every spelling bee, science fair, math contest. No problems at all, right? The parents or grandparents come penniless with only the shirts on their back, but they're the ultimate up by your own bootstraps, Horatio Alger tale. It shows America's great. There are no problems. It's a myth. And I'm going to explain how it's a myth, but it impairs the ability of Asian Americans to participate in various government programs, to have public health needs addressed, and so on and so forth. So let me walk you through this. Now, like most, and sometimes when I talk about this, people say, why can't you accept a compliment, right? To be called a model minority, that sounds very positive. You should just say very graciously, why, thank you, right? When someone says, would you fix my computer? You Asians, you're all so good at that, right? Makes me want to give them a rude gesture and erase their hard drive, right? Let me explain. Like many racial stereotypes, there's a tiny germ of truth, okay? That's exaggerated and distorted to the proposition that Asian Americans are a model minority. How does that happen? Well, you're a social scientist. It's a bimodal distribution. It can both be true, and this is true. It can be both true that Asian American households, on average, in the aggregate, have a higher household income than other demographic groups. Now, that's in part due to higher educational attainment, on average, due to the geographic maldistribution in high income, high cost areas. But the biggest driver of this, it's also true that Asian Americans have greater income stratification than any other racial group. And we see this in New York City, we see it in the CUNY system. There aren't crazy rich Asians among our students, by and large. Our students are rideshare drivers, or the children of rideshare drivers, the laundry workers, the restaurant owners, right? People who are undocumented. How can this be the case that Asian Americans, on the one hand, have higher average household income? It's also more multi-generational households. There are a lot of factors that go into that. And also greater income stratification. Well, it's easy. There are two separate, distinct flows of migration from Asia. One flow is people with human capital or actual capital. They're PhDs, or they're coming here to get PhDs. My parents, they came here as scholarship students, right? And right alongside that, there are those who came on the Golden Venture, which ran aground some 30 years ago, the snakehead smuggling operation. Remember when that was a huge issue in New York City? If you grew up here, you may remember there were multiple cases where enormous numbers of people who were undocumented had difficulty in that case because the ship ran into difficulty. So there are two separate flows in a way that exaggerates these discrepancies. So that's what's happening. You have brain drain, that is selective migration on the one hand, coupled to mass migration of individuals without human capital or financial capital. But there are three reasons that even with a little germ of truth, I would caution against embracing the model minority myth. Here's the first: whitewashing bias. So there was a study in Harvard Business Review. It's actually by someone I know. His name is Buck G. This is the headline. And this is true in academia as well. And this startles everyone because people say this to me. They say, oh, you Asians, you're all doing so well, right? You don't have any problems. That's just not true. Asian Americans are promoted to management at lower rates, not just than whites, than African Americans and Latinos. This particular study looked at Silicon Valley, where Asian Americans are reputed to be dominant, or even higher education. So 5 years ago, CUNY hired 2 Asian American presidents at colleges. David Wu at Baruch and myself at Queens College. We were the first Asian Americans hired at that level in the CUNY system. At that time, there had been no presidents, there had been no vice chancellors of Asian descent, even though the impression everyone has is, oh, Asians, you're all doing so well. That's just not the case. Asian Americans remain significantly underrepresented, even in higher education at all leadership levels, dean and up, especially relative to the representation among faculty. Now, there's some people who say, oh, that's just Asians don't want to pursue leadership roles. That's actually false. That's a stereotype, needless to say. And there's another Queens College faculty member, Joyce Tang, who studied this. She's actually surveyed Asian American managers, and they want to be in charge at the same rates that whites and blacks, Latinos, and everyone else wants to be in charge. They're just not being promoted. Just as a quick aside, I want to give a shout out and a note of appreciation to the Chancellor, Phalo of CUNY. When I was a candidate for the job that I have, my dream job, this is the job that I hope to hold until I retire, as long as Phalo and the board and the faculty are okay with that. So when I was a candidate, this is 5 years ago in 2019, I saw the news. I just happened to be looking at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I had already interviewed. I was waiting. I saw the news. CUNY hires David Wu, president of Baruch, first Asian American president. I said to my wife, this is a true story. I said to my wife, well, that's it. They're not going to hire someone else who's Asian American the same year. And they're certainly not going to hire some guy named Wu. They already hired a Wu. You know, why would they hire a second Asian American with the same name? And no, we're not related. I mean, we almost certainly are distantly, you know, maybe 500 years ago. We're very, very distant cousins. But it worked out. Although my own father said, you know, that's really strange. Why did they hire 2 guys named Wu, right? At any rate, that's the first issue with the model minority myth.
Easier.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah, everywhere I go, the second Asian American president of the CUNY system. Not that I'm resentful. The other issue is Asian Americans are, in the words of historian Ronald Takaki, punished for their virtues rather than their vices. What do I mean by this? I'm going to give you a historical example and then some other examples. A historical example is a progressive, that is left-leaning pamphlet. Back when pamphlets were how you articulated your views. It's written by Samuel Gompers. It's called Meat versus Rice. And you can see the subtitle, American Manhood Against Asiatic Cooleyism, Which Shall Survive? He was a leader of the American Federation of Labor, which continues to exist today, the AFL of AFL-CIO. This is an official publication, and it argues Asians should be kept out. Now, the title, Meat versus Rice, is both literal and metaphorical. Allow me to explain. Gompers actually argues, and this sounds absurd, it sounds ludicrous. You can easily find the text of this online. I encourage you to look at it for yourself. He argues not that people of Asian descent are inferior, he argues they're superior. He says they're better workers. Okay, the literal part of Meat versus Rice, as he says, white men have to eat meat to live. Asian men can just subsist on rice. That's not fair. because meat is more expensive, it's hard to procure, etc. So Asians have an advantage in the marketplace. They've got to be kept out. He extends that, not making this up, you can find this and read for yourself, into an elaborate metaphor that Asians are harder working and therefore will drive out the good and decent white working man. So understand the claim here. This is a racial stereotype, not of inferiority, but of superiority, articulated as the rationale for discrimination. This is a recurring theme. We have to do something, otherwise Asians are going to take over, right? They're too smart, they're too hardworking. So that's part of the model minority myth. There are numerous examples to the present day. People have forgotten about the UCLA student. You know, she portrayed herself as the victim. In the early days of social media, she put up a video at UCLA and complained there are too many Asian people. They've taken over UCLA. Most people who saw the video said, well, this is a racist video. The student was white and she was complaining, you know, she wasn't succeeding because of all the Asians. She then faced ostracism because of her beliefs, ultimately quit UCLA and said she had been the victim of racial discrimination. The third and final reason we should be skeptical about the model minority myth is what is sometimes said. It's the quote used for the title of this academic article, at least not Black. And that's what the model minority myth so often is. It's not about Asian Americans. It's false flattery. It's a way to say to African Americans, Latinos, and others, look at the Asians. They made it. Why can't you? And if Asians made it and they're not white, that shows there isn't a significant problem with racial prejudice. And when you look at how this image is used, including the original New York Times article that came out in 1966 that presents the modern version of this myth, it is almost always to compare and contrast Asian Americans. In honor of your dean having spent so many decades at George Washington University, I'll tell you just a brief anecdote. Again, also true. So here's a way that I think about race. I spent a decade on the faculty at Howard University. I was the first Asian American to be a law professor there. Changed my life. It was profound. And if you're not aware, I am not myself Black. But in the time that I was at Howard, and I was there for a reason, because I believed in its mission. Not quite every day, but certainly every week. So this happened to me 500 times. I would go someplace and people who knew what I did for a living or knew where I did for a living would say to me, what's it like? Are you comfortable? Is it safe? Their questions would become increasingly troubling and problematic, and like so many questions about race, the questions themselves revealed something. This is people who are white. Every now and then someone who's Asian American. It almost never happened with anyone who identified as Black. They would say, what are your students like? What are Black people like? They would say, couldn't you get a job anywhere else? They would say, are you some sort of radical? Are you just really into hip hop? And every now and then someone would look really closely at me and then stammer, are you Black? And they were asking in earnest. They were so puzzled by this that they were sure there was a story. Now, as it happens, my wife is a law professor, also Asian American, who'd been in academia a little longer than me. So she outranked me, as she pointed out from time to time. And she taught across town at another institution, a historically white, a predominantly white institution, except no one called it that, right? It was just mainstream, it's just normal. She taught at George Washington University. And if you went to that law school and looked until the past decade at the oil paintings of the famous alumni who were lawyers who founded firms or judges or legislators, until recently, they were all white men, right? And as an Asian American, and I believe she was the first Asian American on the faculty there, she taught there ultimately 24 years. 0 times, exactly never, was she asked by someone, how does it feel to be surrounded by white people? No one ever asked her if her students were any good, if she could get a job someplace else, if she went to a white institution to make a political statement, right? So if you're neither black nor white, if you straddle the color line, if people don't know where to place you, if you're an Asian American and you're seemingly deliberately among black people, everyone is perplexed. They want to say, no, you don't understand. You're not doing this right. But if you're Asian American among whites, yay, you're upwardly mobile, right? You've achieved the American dream as people see it. So that's the last reason the model minority myth is so troubling, because of the implicit or explicit comparative nature of the stereotype. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to go through this next stereotype very quickly, which is the perpetual foreigner syndrome. The notion that even if you're 6th or 7th generation, you're actually foreign. You aren't really an American. If you're Afro-Asian, such as the vice president, there's something subversive, right? There's something not right. It's the idea, go back to where you came from, which for me is Detroit, the Motor City, right? This is the cause of so much violence, as we saw during the pandemic. I said I would go through this very quickly, so I'll just show you a few of the images. The most significant moment that this expressed itself was during the internment of Japanese Americans. In World War II, 2/3 of the individuals who were incarcerated, about 120,000, along with a handful of Italian and German foreign nationals and Native Alaskans. 2/3 of the Japanese Americans in prison were native-born United States citizens. They were Angelenos. They lived in Los Angeles. They included Christian converts, people who had never visited Japan, as men, women, children, the elderly, disabled. Interestingly, though racial intermarriage, that is, whites with non-whites, remained illegal in so much of the United States, there were a handful of mixed race couples. And if it was a white man and a Japanese woman, they didn't have to go to an internment camp. If it was a Japanese or any Asian man with a white American woman, if the man was a foreign national, remember there was that color bar naturalization, the woman would be stripped of her US citizenship for the marriage. These are just a few images. This one is of a United States Army veteran. So he fought for his nation, that is the United States, during the Great War, being taken away probably by military police whom he outranked when he was in the service. You can see the children waving the American flag. All the images except for the veteran were taken by Dorothea Lange, the famous photographer of the Depression era. And these images were commissioned by the War Relocation Authority, the government entity that ran the internment camp. When they saw the images, though, after having paid Dorothea Lange and others to take these photos, seeing how sympathetically she portrayed the families, they impounded the negatives. These were not permitted to be distributed for some 60 years because they showed ordinary people. There were, by the way, 0 cases of sabotage or other subversive activities by Japanese Americans. And they formed the 2 most highly decorated United States military units in national history, the 442nd and 100th, fighting predominantly throughout Europe as their families remained incarcerated. Some also served in the Pacific in the military intelligence service. So this isn't just rhetoric. This image has real consequences. And the anti-Asian sentiments, by the way, some people will say, well, it's because of Pearl Harbor. Not true. The images preceded Pearl Harbor. And though people said falsely that Japanese Americans were involved with Pearl Harbor, that's just not the case. People spread rumors, oh, Japanese American farmers planted their crops in Hawaii to guide the Japanese Imperial Navy and so on. Even Dr. Seuss, this is a cartoon by Theodore Geisel before he became Dr. Seuss, produced war propaganda. This shows Japanese Americans lining up as the fifth column, the term from the Spanish Civil War for the enemy within. It says waiting for the signal, right? So it shows Japanese Americans being issued dynamite, TNT, to help Japan, even though Japanese Americans proved themselves, as if they had to be loyal United States citizens. I'll just very briefly say this slide may be known to those who have studied Asian American history. In 1982, in Detroit, my hometown, the reason I do this work is there was a fellow, I didn't know him. His name was Vincent Chin. He was bludgeoned to death by auto workers, one of whom was out of work. You may know Detroit is the Motor City. It's called that because the major US car companies, then the big four, were based there. There was a terrible recession in the late 70s, early 80s. Detroit was hard hit. Unemployment, inflation were worse even than during the Great Recession we just suffered. And these auto workers looked at Chin and called him a Jap. Pardon the racial slur, I use it deliberately, even though he was Chinese American. So this was mistaken identity twice over. He was Chinese, not Japanese, not that it would be helpful to say I'm a chink, not a Jap. And he was an American, working class, just like his assailants, except for the color of skin, texture of hair, and shape of eyes. He was killed. This is not an isolated example. We saw that during COVID, when dozens, including the elderly, were shoved to the ground, kicked in the head, spat upon, stabbed, and shot by people who said, "You are making us sick. This is your fault," including people who were not of Chinese descent at all, but were Korean, Filipino, Burmese, and in some instances, Latina, but who looked Asian. This is just a slide, again, to bring together some of these themes of Asian Americans who served in the United States military. That's Senator Daniel Inouye. You can see, look carefully at the sleeve of his suit that there's something odd about the right sleeve. He lost his arm charging a Nazi bunker. He's there with JFK. The Filipino veterans who fought, who decades later achieved citizenship and veterans benefits. They were issued a promise at the time the United States reneged on that if they fought for the United States, they would be guaranteed citizenship. It included women who fought. That's one of two women aviators on the Naval Air Force. Current sitting Senator Tammy Duckworth is Anglo-Asian. When she debated, when she was first running for her current office, she was in a debate and her opponent, a white male, when she was just mentioning her military service, and she said, "My family has served the United States for 13 generations." He mocked her and said, "Well, he didn't know there were Asians at Valley Forge." She can make that statement honestly because on her father's side, she could be in the Daughters of the American Revolution. And on her mother's side, she's Thai Chinese. So this just gives you a sense of the complexity of the Asian American experience, diversity within diversity, including, for example, if you're Jewish or if you've been to a bat mitzvah, you might know what this is. This is an Asian American adoptee whose parents are Jewish, celebrating her bat mitzvah. Charles Mingus, my favorite jazz artist, who is Afro-Asian, and his second album, Mingus Dynasty, he's not making fun of Asian people. He's paying homage to his grandfather with his Chinese themed garb. There are Afro-Asians, Asian Latinos. These are just a few slides of some of the headlines from the pandemic that we've now forgotten. And the Atlanta shooting, that's when 6 of the 8 victims were Asian women targeted by someone who went out specifically to shoot people of Asian descent and killed 8. This central image you may remember. This was, that's a woman, Filipina, on her way to church. I think it was in Midtown. It's here in Manhattan. She's assaulted, kicked in the head until she's in critical condition. That's not the shocking part of the video. And I wouldn't encourage you to get this, but it went viral. You can easily find. The shocking part, this is surveillance video. There are two doormen, big guys, who watched the entire thing. And when it was over and the victim was lying prone on the ground, they went and they closed the door and turned around and walked away. So this gives you some sense of the very real detrimental effects of the model minority myth, the idea that Asians are all doing well, and the perpetual foreigner syndrome that they're all foreign, which combine create the sense of resentment. You're all well-to-do foreigners taking over New York City. This is your comeuppance. This just gives you a sense of a few issues about gender. I'm sorry to give them short shrift, but we can talk about them in Q&A. This continues as there are proposals in multiple states, including New York State, to deprive Chinese immigrants of the ability to buy real estate. The idea being that it poses a national security threat. There's a project, I'll close here on a moment of hope. Early on in my tenure during the pandemic, I was invited to an event in Flushing, Queens, to address these issues of hate. The Yellow Whistle campaign is an effort to issue yellow whistles to reclaim yellow, which has been a pejorative and also symbolic of cowardice, and to give whistles to people to blow for help. I was invited in Flushing to be part of a rally against hate. And when my turn came to speak at the podium, I said a couple of things that were true. The first is I'd never seen a rally like this. Then Lieutenant Governor Hochul was there. Senate Majority Leader Schumer was there. Civil rights activist Al Sharpton was there. There were people who were white, there were people who were black, there were people who were Latino, there were people who were Jewish and Christian and Muslim, there were labor leaders, there were LGBT leaders, all standing in solidarity with Asian Americans. There were about 36 speakers, only 3 or 4 of whom were Asian American. And that's good. There were more than 24 speakers of every other type of background you can imagine who said, I am here to stand with Asian Americans today. I, your brother, I'm your sister. I also have Asian descent. And the other thing I said is I looked out at the crowd and I saw young people and old people, right? People who were well-to-do, well-dressed, and people less so, of Asian descent, carrying signs that were going to march. I said, I've never seen hundreds of Asian Americans about to march like this, to stand up and to speak out and to participate in democracy and to say, I'm an American, I'm an equal, this is my nation, I'm here to stay. And that ultimately gives me hope. So I've tried to present to you a little bit of a snapshot to give you a sense, not only of Asian American, because this is not about self-aggrandizement, but to give you a sense of the complexity of race. And I hope that by introducing all peoples into diversity, equity, inclusion, we will understand that this project of self-governance, this nation which beckons like that proverbial city upon a hill, in New York City in particular, where anyone, by proclaiming a belief in the civic virtues and the ideals that are part of the CUNY system, that they too can participate, not only participate, but give back in a meaningful way and help to create this nation that for so many of us has long represented hope. And I continue to believe in the promise of our diverse democracy. Thank you so very much. Do we have time for a question or two? I know we need to be mindful and there's a webinar. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Is there a mic?
The mic is in the ceiling. Yeah. It was really thought-provoking. It's really.
Here, please.
No, you stand there because I think you're going to need a mic to answer the questions. So I want to open the floor up first to our audience to see if there are any burning questions.
So a question going back to the income divide, the bimodal. I just wonder, is that really more extreme in the Asian American community than it is in other demographics within the United States?
Yes, so income stratification, you just look at stratification within a defined racial group. Asian Americans display the greatest gap. And you can see it in New York City. So you may read in the newspaper every now and then about a crazy rich Asian who buys a condominium, a penthouse suite for $100 million. Does that happen? Yes, that does happen. And then if you look at CUNY students, right? Our students, some of whom are undocumented of Asian descent, whose parents are undocumented, whose parents work, whose mother works at a nail salon, making minimum wage or less illegally. Both those populations coexist side by side, and that is what's creating this huge stratification. And there are huge differences among different ethnic groups. If you look at the different ethnic groups, but even within a single ethnic group, it could be Chinese, it could be Indian, you will still see the income stratification within one ethnic group. There are some studies, and I am not expert in this area, so I don't want to misspeak, but there are some studies that actually further suggest that Asians, on average, are better off, the Asians in the United States are better off than Asian Americans, meaning that those who have come here who are foreign nationals, again, on average, are better off than native born. Now, you might wonder, how can that be? The answer is brain drain, wealth transfer. The person who bought the penthouse for $100 million may be an absentee landlord, right? Or they may be part of a multi-generational dynasty where the bulk of the family is going to remain in Hong Kong or wherever, and they've sent a son, a daughter, or grandson or granddaughter to reside in that $100 million penthouse, right? So you can easily, if you poke around, find the various academic articles for the proposition that the income stratification within the category of Asian American is greater even than among other minority communities. And it is primarily, but not exclusively, due to the flows of migration, and there being two flows side by side. Yeah, right.
One of the issues amongst Asian Americans is the diversity
Yes,
of phenotype.
yes,
They present themselves
Right.
outwardly to the world and how they view themselves. And that hurts some of the statistics.
Right.
For example, very early on in the COVID pandemic in New York City, the highest mortality rate amongst any group was amongst a group that identified themselves as other.
right.
And it took the Department of Health a great deal of time to identify who these people were. First, we found out that they were in Queens, and then discovered that they were actually from Bangladesh.
Yeah,
They were cab drivers, they were in service industry, they were using public transportation, and they did not identify as Asian,
right.
because to them, that nomenclature meant more East Asian than themselves. They identified more with the Middle East that had no ethnic classification, and therefore, when questioned, placed themselves under other.
Right. That's a great example.
So
Mhm.
at that time, the greatest mortality from COVID in New York is amongst Asians. It would have been seen in another context.
That's right. That's right. What I sometimes explain is the following. You know, if you were to go to Asia and stand on a street corner in Shanghai, Seoul, or Saigon, and as people pass by, if you said to them, "What are you? Who are you? What is your racial group, your ethnicity?" 1 out of 100 would say they're Asian, right? There aren't Asians in Asia in the same way as there aren't that many Africans in Africa, and there aren't that many, there are some Europeans in Europe, right? And you have to be of a certain background to make a statement, I am an Asian, right? People will identify by their national origin, their ethnic group, their language, their linguistic community, their faith, right? They might identify by a specific dialect even, or by a province, or by a clan. So it doesn't surprise me at all. It's not just Bangladeshis. I'll give you another example. If you were to ask my father, are you an Asian person? He wouldn't say he's an Asian person. That's not how he identifies. It doesn't come naturally to him. If you pressed him and if you gave him a list, and if you said, here are your choices, he might eventually work his way to Asian. But if you just asked him spontaneously, he would not answer Asian. And he's not atypical. There are many, many communities. The New York Times had a big article on the Bhutanese community, which by and large doesn't identify as Asian American. Now, I don't know that there's empirical research that supports this next statement I'm going to make, but I will wager you money that most Asian Americans don't identify as Asian American. And it's not just that. My father, who is a US citizen, my mother passed away about 10 years ago. I'll tell you just a very quick story about this. My father also would not likely identify as American, right? Because when I was growing up and my parents would talk at the dinner table about our neighbors, they would refer to those people as Americans or as foreigners, right? Though in Mandarin, they would always refer to Black people as Black people, right? So it shows implicit bias, shows all sorts of things. But when my mother passed away, my father decided that she would be buried outside suburban Washington, D.C. That's where he resides, right? Kid brothers reside, two younger brothers, they're twins, they're United States Foreign Service officers. So in one generation, my family went from immigrant to representatives of the United States in its diplomatic corps. I'm the failure of the three. So I said to my father, well, don't you want to take the ashes either to Taiwan or to China? The other aspect of this is complicated is my parents would actually, in some sense, be stateless people because they come from a place that doesn't exist anymore. That is the Republic of China in mainland China. That went away in the late 1940s, right? And they were part of the exiled group in Taiwan. Anyway, my father said about the proposition that we could take my mother's ashes to Taiwan. He said, no, family is here now. So my father recognizes in some sense that the family, his progeny, his grandchildren are Americans, even if he himself wouldn't identify as Asian and wouldn't identify as American. Right? Asian American is an artificial identity. If you actually want to know the history, it comes from two different sources, just very briefly. One is in the 1960s, and this sounds preposterous to anyone who hasn't studied this, there was a yellow power movement in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was modeled on Black power as part of the third world strikes at San Francisco State University and at Cal Berkeley and so on. And then in 1976, the public health school almost certainly looks at this, and you're familiar with this. The OMB issued Directive 15, which governs to this day. It created the classifications used on the census and in every other government form. If you've ever wondered on government forms, why are there these classifications? These are the ones that exist. They're always with the same wording. It's because of OMB Directive 15, which I think issued in either 76 or 78. Someone in the room probably has the exact date. It's a bureaucratic document. That's what created 5 official categories for the United States. But thank you for the question and the observation. I, as always, agree with you entirely.
Yes. The first is from CUNY SPH Professor Emma Sui. This would be the comment. She writes, thank you for this excellent presentation. Toward the model minority myth as a public health issue, Kathy Parkhong's extraordinary book, Minor Feelings, vividly describes some of the psychological dimensions of this, along with numerous other important works of art and writing. Just a quick note to build in this conversation. And we have a question from Melinda Chu. What was the effect of 9/11 on Asian Americans?
Yeah, so We've already forgotten this, but post 9/11, there was enormous targeting of people of South Asian background because of the stereotype that they were somehow terrorists. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. And it included people of the Sikh faith. Now, I want to be clear. It would not be right to target people who are Muslim and to say, we blame you for 9/11. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But hate often involves mistaken identity, as in the pandemic and in so many of these instances in the Vincent Chin case, because the first person killed in post 9/11 violence by people who targeted him in a hate crime was someone not Muslim, but Sikh, who was bearded, turbaned, and dark skinned. So there was enormous backlash, and here's a Queens College version of this. There was a recent graduate by the name of Hamdani, Salman Hamdani, went by Saul. And he was a police cadet and EMT, right? So he was trained, he wanted to go to medical school. He thought being a police cadet and an EMT would be helpful. He was in Manhattan and he saw the towers go down, or he saw the airplane strike before the towers went down, and he went running toward the towers to be of use. Okay? He lost his life. All right. Witnesses reported him performing heroic good acts. Regrettably, after 9/11, NYPD, this is all well attested to, and I want to thank NYPD for other things they've done, but this was an unfortunate incident in chapter. They identified Salman Hamdani as a potential terrorist. He was a missing person, but they wanted to find him and conducted a manhunt in the belief that he was an operative on the ground. Why? The only reason, apparently, that he was singled out in this way was because of his ethnic background and his Islamic faith. All right. The story eventually emerged, and if you Google him, you'll find Mayor Bloomberg then recognized that he was a hero of 9/11. He's been appropriately recognized as, although there's still an effort to deem him a first responder because he was a cadet, not yet a fully enlisted officer of NYPD and an EMT. He is not acknowledged in the official, there's an official list of first responders who lost their lives, but there's no question he lost his life. He was helping, he was in no way a terrorist, yet he was identified as a suspect for no reason other than ethnicity and faith. So 9/11 was a watershed moment. And it just shows how powerful these images are, that this is not history, and it's not just rhetoric, that this affects people's lives to this day. Do we have time for one last question?
Actually,
We're done. My apologies. I don't want to overstay my welcome. Oh, we'll chat at lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.